So now that we know what a frequency distribution is, we've seen examples of how to make them by hand, how to make them using technology. The next thing we're going to talk about is the graph for a frequency distribution. So how we graph a frequency distribution is we graph it using a histogram. A histogram is the graph of a frequency distribution. So in order to make a histogram, you have to first have broken the data up into classes and counted the frequencies to make the frequency distribution. So I'm using a frequency histogram here. There's different types of histograms that we can see, but typically we'll only be talking about frequency histograms and relative frequency histograms. And frequency histograms, I'll just be calling histograms. So what a histogram is it is a bar graph that represents the frequency distribution. So it takes the frequency distribution and it displays it to us as a graph. The horizontal scale for a histogram is always quantitative. If you remember back from a previous lesson, quantitative means that we're talking about number data and we're not talking about qualities. We're not talking about names. We're talking about something that is numbers. More specifically, not only is it quantitative, but it's usually also continuous data too. The vertical scale on a histogram measures the frequency of the classes. So each bar represents one of the classes, and how high that bar goes tells us the frequency that that group, that class had. In a histogram, consecutive bars must be touching. All that means is that bars next to each other need to be touching. The graph should not look like this. You see how these bars aren't touching? The bars should actually all be next to each other and touching. And bars begin and end at class boundaries. And we'll talk about what class boundaries are and why we use them in a second. So to find class boundaries, we're just going to be subtracting 0.5 from lower class limits and then adding 0.5 to upper class limits. And we'll look at an example of that in the next video here. Whenever you are creating a histogram, and not just a histogram, really any graph that you're graphing, you should make sure that your axes are labeled. And the graph should also have a title. So in the next video, we're going to look at an example where we compute class boundaries and use those class boundaries to graph a histogram by hand. And then I will also show you how we can create a histogram using StatCrunch.